I'm Sarah Hodges, and this is Executives Uncut, the podcast where we provide solutions for the corporate cycle of hell. And today we're talking about rigidity, and I'm here again with Fergus Connolly, performance coach, author, and TED Talk speaker, as part of our Concepts of Chaos series. Hey, Fergus.
Sarah.
Hi, Fergus. I always forget to say that you're also Dr. Fergus Connolly.
There's
Look
no
at
need.
you. Look at you getting all shy. Fergus is really awesome. So also, total disclaimer, I guess, we always do these podcasts live. They come to you raw, unedited, just like we promised. But today is our very first time streaming them to Facebook and LinkedIn. So you can comment below and ask questions throughout the podcast that we can address at the end. Or, look for them to pop up in future weeks because we're going to continue to do this. But to be honest, we don't really know what we're doing, so it might take us a little bit. We might fumble a little while as you guys go ahead and send comments to us. So, but let's get to our content, Fergus. Lack of flexibility in structures, right? Rigidity. When people have a hard time being flexible with their processes, with their thinking, with the people that are around them. What do you think about that? Have you come across it in your practice?
Oh yeah. Like I mean, it's one of the paradoxes. As you're training, even just growing up, you're taught. You're taught structure. You're taught how to think. But in reality, of course, the world is chaotic and it's always changing. So it's finding that balance between having structure and some rigidity, and then being flexible and able to adapt.
Yeah, I think a lot of people they come to me, they're like, I want to be a machine, I want to just like eat the same thing every day for breakfast and I want to do the exact same things every day. And I love that. I think that's great, but I think that it's not sustainable, right? Are maybe able to do it for a week or a day, or if they're really lucky, a couple of months, but it gives this illusion of control, right? And it can also prevent them from growth in other areas. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And people will hear things or read things and see things and go, I have to do this in this order, in this way, every single day. And again, the world's not like that. Things are going to happen and you have to be able to adapt. But at the same time, you have to have some series of principles or structure or sequence to be able to get anything done. So again, it's a balance. It's a balancing act. It's a paradox, and I think that's one of the things that we can help people with is understanding how to create a system that allows them to continue to progress, get things done, and keep that balance between being flexible at the same time.
Yes, flexible structure, which I think we've talked about in a previous podcast. But, I want to bring up there's also people who are already very rigid. It's not necessarily their goal because their life is chaotic. They're very disciplined, very rigid, but the discipline becomes it's something that they have to do. It becomes obligatory, right? Unless they have this discipline, unless they have this rigidity, they are very uncomfortable. And sometimes I think, don't you think that can lead to complacency, like lack of creativity or a reluctance to adapt and shift in times of change? And I'm sure that those particular individuals are having a more difficult time in a COVID or a pandemic environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes then what happens is the discipline itself of maintaining the structure becomes a greater burden than the work itself.
Yes.
And there becomes an illusion, oh, well, I'm not sticking to my usual schedule, so therefore I'm not getting work done, which can be misleading at times. And then obviously, like I mean, COVID or something on a global scale or a national scale is unique, but at the same time, you will always have small amounts of change. So it's ensuring that the rigidity and the structure doesn't become a disadvantage.
Yeah, and I think that you've mentioned so many times already, it's a balance, and you're absolutely right. It is a balance, and I think that you know sometimes people really need more rigidity because it makes them feel safer and in control of their environment. But as a leader, that often leads to micromanaging. And instead of being a leader that's kind of more of a coach, right? And lets their staff lead themselves and take ownership of their projects, the micromanager needs, in order to feel safe and feel in control, they need to like be very particular about not just what their staff does, but how their staff does it. And and can end up being kind of punitive in terms of the way that they deliver their roles and responsibilities and tasks to their staff. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, the simplest example for people to think about, for example, is football or any kind of sport where a coach goes out with a fixed game plan and just keeps banging away, but it's not working. And you see it time and time again where certain coaches just have one game plan or one system or one series of approaches. It's not working. And everybody, there's 80,000 people, 100,000 people screaming at them to change, but they don't see it. And the same thing happens in life, happens in business, where people appear to have just one very rigid approach and not being able to change, and then just focusing on sticking to the game plan. So that's the best way to explain it to people.
Yeah, it's funny you brought up sport because back when I used to do more wellness coaching, I saw that a lot with weight loss too, or kind of people trying to adopt healthy habits, and they became very, very rigid about how they were going to do it, and then they would plateau and be really confused because what they were doing was no longer working for them. And so that's a time when you have to adapt and figure out something new, but that can be very stress-inducing and very frustrating for somebody who's finding that peace in their rigidity. So, so what are some solutions? What have you recommended to your clients?
Yeah, so I first came across this many years ago when I was learning programming. And in programming, you get this idea of object-oriented programming. So you create blocks of code, but you can move them around. And I use the very same approach, is that we understand what the key things are, but we still have the flexibility to move those so that we can make it work for you. So for example, you've got key things that you have to get done throughout the day, but if your day and your structure, something happens, you still have the flexibility to move those around on your daily schedule. And it gives you the confidence in knowing that you're still going to get the work done. You can adapt and you can move it around. That's just a very simple example from a scheduling perspective. And having the priority, so knowing which things are key and which things we can move. And it actually, when you understand it, and when you understand that you can be flexible, it gives you incredible confidence in being able to adapt and tackle other challenges that come along.
Yeah, that's a really good point because really change is what's constant. So if you have structure that is adaptable, I call it flexible structure. And I had a friend a very long time ago, and I may have mentioned this in a previous podcast, so sorry if I did because I refer to it so often. But he was talking about how you can have structure that's like bricks. Have I talked about this? Or structure that's like spaghetti and it just you can easily move it around, or like a spine. And so I always think of having flexible structure like a spine where it's solid, but you can also move and adapt and hopefully be flexible with it. So a couple of tools that I like to give my executives is to build in white space because you're probably going to need it. And if you aren't building in enough white space, then you might be getting stressed out around that time, because there's just too many things like bombarding you all at once. Um, Also, I like to have a to-do list that is time and project oriented, so I can plug the to-dos into the different time blocks that I have, and also having time blocks where you're working on one individual thing at that time. I'm answering emails at this time, I'm working on this project at this time, this is my open hours, office hours at this time, and they can move and be different, in different slots on a day-to-day basis. But also having routine, like we haven't really talked about routine so much. Having a routine when you get up every day that's relatively the same every day, when you go to bed that's relatively the same every day, so you don't have to think about it. Like you just, how many of us really are like deep in thought about brushing our teeth when we're brushing our teeth? No, we're just going on autopilot, right? And so the more things in your day that you can kind of get to go on autopilot like that, but that aren't so fixed that you can't ever change them, I think is really important. Like some practical ways to build this into your day. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think what's critical is understanding what the outcome is or what the purpose is. So
Yeah.
it's principle based. So you focus. I know people use the phrase "trust the process," and I always put a small proviso: don't get focused on the process itself too much, because that has to be somewhat flexible. So long as you understand what the outcomes are, and you can adapt to that, like you said, that's the purpose of the routine. And then there are times when routine is critical. So there's certain things that as precursors that set you up to do something. So there might be 3 or 4 things you do before a meeting all of the time that again allow you find that state of flow, and then you can progress. So it's just knowing what those things are, but not getting too tied in to the actual and being too rigid in itself. And again, that breeds confidence that you can adapt and change to whatever comes along.
Yeah, and at its roots, I think that rigidity is a self-leadership issue. Last week with Anna Howden, our associate coach, we talked a lot about self-leadership. And at Hodges Coaching, the third element of self-leadership is self-governance. And self-governance is this responsibility idea of having some sort of structure, some element of rigidity, but not too much, with a balance of flexibility. And so if you're finding that you are way too rigid and you're getting really stressed out about it, or people don't find you to be flexible, and when you're working with them, this might be an indication that you have personal work to do. It's more about you than it is about your environment or your staff. And I think it's important to ask yourself the question, like, what about rigidity? What about rules makes me feel safe and comfortable? And when you're able to identify what about that makes you feel safe and comfortable, then you can start to say, okay, well, where do I want to change? Where do I want to adapt? Where am I kind of going overboard here? But we haven't really talked about, how this works with staff, not just within yourself. So what about developing like staff adaptability when your staff is too rigid?
Yeah, so for me, it's very much about understanding principles or systems thinking so that you can explain what the outcomes are, and staff then can adapt and address those problems. But long term, what you want to, just like you said about your own self development, you want to help staff continue to develop, because very often what happens is we train staff up and we give them a very rigid structure because that gets them started. But you want to transition your staff and you want to encourage them to continue to develop and help them self-reflect, identify areas that they want to improve on, that will continue to allow them become more adaptable, not rigid in their thinking, not rigid in their actions, their techniques themselves. And so that's particularly important when you're developing a staff that can be very adaptable, that isn't fixed in either in thinking or in action.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's also about having that purpose, that ultimate objective that everybody unifies around. But I think it's really important to let your staff get there in the way that works best for them. Some people are naturally going to be inclined to more rigidity. I certainly am one of those people. Some people are naturally inclined to more flexibility. My husband's one of those people, and it creates conflict in our home, and this can create conflict in corporations. So how do you deal with that when two people are at one end of the spectrum or the other?
I laugh, I smile because it's something that like initially it becomes challenging, because you're looking and go, why are they not working like I'm working? Why can't they do it the way? And slowly, you realize, well, not everybody's like you, and people use different approaches to get things done. And it's being able to enjoy the fact that somebody can do something in a different way. When that becomes apparent, and when you accept that, then it's easier for you to understand that other people just have different approaches, but you still want to help them continue to develop and add more skills to their development. But I honestly do smile and watch how other people approach problems differently, and I learn a lot from
Mhm.
watching people solve problems in a different way, and that's how you learn. But the first stage is recognizing that not everybody's going to do it the way that you're going to do it.
Yeah, I think that there's also a combination of tools that can be used here, right? Like out of the box thinking, we've talked about that a little bit earlier, like kind of what if scenarios to help people think about things outside of their normal way of showing up in the world. And also, combining that with some compassionate boundaries. Like know where your boundaries are. Like I'm comfortable going here and no further and communicating them, but here's the thing, also knowing the exceptions to the rules. I think that people who lean more toward rigidity are like, no, no exceptions ever. And like 99.9% of the time, there's going to be some exceptions. Like, you have office hours and you don't want anybody to knock on your door, but if your kid's sick, you do, right? There's exceptions to rules. If the building's on fire, you want someone to knock on your door. So how do you bring in these what if scenarios and these compassionate boundaries together into a corporate environment?
I think one of the first things is working backwards. It's one of the mistakes that I made very early on as well, was focusing very much on rules from the bottom up, so to speak. So like you said, these are fixed office hours, or these are things that must be done, rather than looking at the outcome and working backwards. Because when you work backwards, when you get back down to the detail, then you realize, okay, well, not all of these details are critical. And then being able to say, okay, well, some of these are flexible, so long as we've achieved, or we are achieving the outcomes within reason. The worst thing that you can do is start from the bottom and have a whole list of rules and criteria that maybe don't all work, that don't work for everybody. So recognizing, like you said, that people have different approaches, different things work for them. And recognizing that at the start is very, very important.
Yeah, I love that just working backward idea. And also when you're doing that, I think it's okay to bring in the what if, like what if, even kind of like what other objectives would I be okay with? Because I think sometimes we get so fixated on what it is that we want to accomplish, or our ultimate objective, that it actually creates stress because we have this space between where we are now and where we want to be. And by broadening it a little bit can be really beneficial. What do you think?
Yeah, and sometimes I think it's important, and people, sometimes with time constraints don't get the opportunity to do it, but having or making time to discuss what the different, potential wrenches that could be thrown into the works could be, talking about them, discussing them. And it's, to be honest, it's playing, but it's playing with these ideas and discussing them so that people hear and know, okay, these are some of the things that could happen. And being able to have those discussions can be very, very helpful, because when something does happen, then, okay, well, we've kind of discussed that, so we know how we're going to solve it. And one other very important thing is that discussing these things, these outside the box, having these outside the box conversations, being familiar with the conversation means that when something does happen, it's not the first time that you're having one of these kinds of debates or kinds of conversations. And that becomes very, very important, because you're familiar, you're able to question other people, you're comfortable being questioned, you're comfortable discussing things. That is
Hmm.
particularly important,
It
because you become,
actually, oh, go ahead.
sorry, last point,
Yeah.
you become a group of problem solvers rather than just problem thinkers or problem finders, and it just shifts the mindset.
Yeah, I just got really excited because it reminds me so much of our podcast planning, right? In the very first ones, there was a lot of discussion and questioning each other and trying to figure out what direction we wanted to go in. And the last time we planned these podcasts, we just were like, we hardly spoke. We were just working on the document together and both typing stuff in. It was total think sync. And I think that's what can happen when you have discussions about your ultimate objective, that when you actually go to execute, it becomes much easier.
Yeah, I've been fortunate to work with one or two really high performing teams, and it can become a lot of fun, more in hindsight, when you look back at where you have these meetings where you go, okay, what are the craziest, essentially the craziest things that could happen while we're trying to achieve this, and you come up with some ridiculous ideas, but you actually talk them through, and then when you leave the meeting, everybody knows, no matter what happens, no matter what crazy thing or disruptive thing that could happen, we have either a solution for it specifically, or we can adapt one of those solutions. So we are prepared. We're not in control, but we're extremely well prepared for whatever might happen. And and the purpose is not necessarily to have an exact solution. The purpose is to have a group of people who can adapt to change. And that's, again, the antithesis of rigidity. It creates a group that's adaptable, problem solvers that can address any kind of disruption that occurs moving forward.
Yes, which is like work goals, right? So let's get to some tips. Is that okay? Are we ready to move into tip
Yes.
time? Because I think that people are like, all right, now how do I give me some concrete takeaways, Sarah? So first tip, look at your day, evaluate it. Evaluate where you become stressed out because your plan gets interrupted, like this morning when I spilled my coffee all over the place. And if you get stressed out when your plan gets interrupted, that's an area where you may need to build in flexibility or some white space into your calendar. Tip number 2, ask your staff and family members where you could be more flexible. Trust me, they will be able to tell you. And they might also give you very individual answers because again, everybody needs a different level of flexibility versus rigidity. And then in order to help your staff grow in this area, ask them about areas where they can develop and try to help direct them. They actually might surprise you when you ask them instead of telling them where you think they should change. And one bonus tip that I thought of throughout this podcast is evaluate when you're looking at your day, evaluate what can go on your wait list. Create a wait list. It's an amazing tool. It can be really helpful, of things that you're going to get to at some point. But it's amazing how things that aren't really important at the moment can end up on our ultimate priority list when they really can be pushed back. Sounds crazy, but it works. So your coaching challenge for the day, identify areas where you're too rigid, whether it's your schedule or your mindset. Where can you be more flexible? Fergus, any last comments?
No, you summed it up perfectly.
We did because we prepared that ahead of time.
But not too rigidly.
But not too rigidly. I changed a lot of it and added a bonus. All right. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to this episode of Executives Uncut, our first time streaming live to LinkedIn and Facebook. We're also going to try to stream live to YouTube, a few other places. So if you enjoyed the content, make sure to subscribe and share with someone who could benefit. And visit hodgescoaching.com for new episodes or follow us at Hodges Coaching on social media. I'm Sarah Hodges here with Fergus Connolly, and I'll see you next week.